done for the legacy of Nuremberg, and also for the history of our understanding of the prosecution and the legal issues related to Katyn. I want to make three brief observations or remarks about this. The first is about what it does for the historical record. There is now quite a literature, very interesting discussions about the role of international justice in establishing the historical record. The Nuremberg judgment and the trial proceedings themselves, but the judgment specifically, is an extremely important part of history. It clarifies historical truth. It's a record of historical truth. It shows the shortcoming of using judgments to clarify historical truth, because there are parts of the historical truth that the judgment can't get at easily, including, of course, the crimes committed by those who are not being prosecuted, in this case, Katyn, but it's not the only one. One of the references I came across in my research was in a document called the Butler Memorandum. The Butler Memorandum is a document prepared by a historian in the British Foreign Office, I think in the 1970s, or perhaps later, based on the documents in the British archives dealing with Katyn. And the document can be located on the internet. In that memorandum, he cites various components of the way that the British were dealing with Katyn during the trial at Nuremberg. And in particular, notes that after the Soviets tabled their evidence in February of 1946, the British ambassador in Tehran wrote to the Foreign Office in London and said, as far as he was concerned, the Russians had done the deed. The Russians had done it. And then there was an exchange of notes within the British Foreign Office, and instructions were sent out to the British prosecutor at Nuremberg on how to deal with the matter. One of the very interesting things in that documentation is a memo from one of the British diplomats to the file saying that maybe it was better that they dealt with Katyn and that they got a judgment against the Germans so that it could all be laid to rest. A great, wonderful example of a cynical bureaucrat who sees this as an opportunity not to write history, but to distort history, to create a dishonest historical record. And again, it's to the credit of the judgment that it doesn't do that. It leaves it unsaid. The second issue of the Katyn issue is fascinating for what it tells us about how the prosecutors operate. Contemporary prosecutors, I'm talking about the present-day institutions, have provisions written into the statutes of their tribunals saying that they are to be independent and to take instructions from no one. Steve Rapp will remember the provision in the statute of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. But at Nuremberg, it was not the case. The four prosecutors at Nuremberg were in fact representing their governments, and they were taking instructions. I've always wanted to know much more about this, about how that came out and the kinds of instructions they were getting. And we get bits of insight into this in the documentation about Katyn, although I'm sure there's a great deal we don't know. One thing that we would love to know would be how much the Soviet prosecutor knew about it. Was the Soviet prosecutor in on the lie? Did he know that the Soviets had done it? Or was he simply basing himself on the official doctrine that was coming out from the Soviet authorities? I don't know that we know that. We don't know the kinds of instructions that he would have got. Justice Jackson, in his testimony before the Select Committee, spoke to this a little bit, and he was asked directly, did he get instructions? And I'm quoting now from page 1954 of his testimony. He says that they ask if he did get instructions on this, and he says, no, as a matter of fact, I received very little instruction from anybody. The thing was a lawyer's job, and I had no instructions. If I may be so blunt as to say so, I thought that having once gotten me into it, there was a pronounced disposition to leave everything to me. He may not have been getting any instructions. I'm not sure that the same can be said of his deputy, Wild Bill Donovan, who was actually there representing U.S. military intelligence. And there have been some fascinating studies now about the connections between the intelligence establishment and the role of the prosecution team, and not Jackson himself, but those who were working with him. And in that famous Butler memorandum, there's very definite evidence of instructions going out from the British Foreign Office to the British prosecution team at Katyn. And they essentially told them, don't do anything, don't help the Soviets, this is their problem, just sit it out and watch. The final point, and this is really about what Katyn has done to the narrative, to our understanding of Nuremberg. Katyn is usually raised in the context of the victor's justice critique of Nuremberg. It's the idea that Nuremberg was profoundly flawed because it only prosecuted one side. Jackson explained to the Select Committee, he was quite correct, that the tribunal at Nuremberg had no jurisdiction to prosecute the Soviets and to make a finding of guilt with respect to the Soviets, even if they had the evidence to do so. But in many, many comments about the Nuremberg trial, people say this was a one-sided prosecution, and Katyn is only one of the examples that's given, by the way. Frequently, the critiques of Nuremberg include reference to the bombing of German cities by the British and the Americans, and the role of Churchill and others in the decisions to firebomb these cities with terrible loss of life. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Americans with the atomic bomb and the terrible destruction that brought about. The submarine warfare issues, it's a subject for a whole other conference about this two-sided prosecution. Speaking of Nuremberg as a whole, maybe setting aside the particular problem of Katyn, would prosecuting the Allies, would prosecuting the Americans for bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or for submarine warfare, or prosecuting the British, would this have brought us closer to reconciliation after the Second World War? I don't believe that. I want to say in as much as I can give a conclusion, and I will try to write this up in more detail, that I'm a great fan and a great enthusiast of Nuremberg. I would hate to see frustration with the issue of Katyn and justice for the victims and the survivors of Katyn used as an issue to tarnish the great accomplishment of the Nuremberg trial. Nor am I at all of the view that Nuremberg was flawed or failed because there were not even-handed prosecutions on the other side. What would we have done? Had a second tribunal with 23 American defendants and a third, and German judges, by the way, and then a third tribunal with 23 British defendants and German and Japanese judges? I don't know that would have brought us closer to justice. I think that the problem actually with international justice, and it's a lingering one, maybe it's even more acute in a place like the International Criminal Court, where we have to choose not just the defendants in a given situation, but we have to choose the situation to go and prosecute, is that these are decisions with a great political dimension to them. They have an inevitable political dimension, and yet we leave them to prosecutors. And I think that's perhaps too big a burden to put on their shoulders. Thank you.